Okay,
Right.
so welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. Today we're going to have a last lecture from Lachance. Take us away.
Okay, cool. So thanks for coming, everyone, first of all. So I thought a lot about what I want to leave with you, and this is what I came up with. So it's clear that on some level, documentation is something that we see as valuable in the data org. And I think we've had some significant pockets of success. But at the same time, I think we haven't yet really figured out how to make documenting our work part of our organizational DNA. So as I do, I've thought a lot about this and why this might be. And I think there might be there's really a couple things at play. So the first is that I think we haven't yet clearly articulated the purpose of writing documentation. We think of it as something that we should do. We feel guilty for not doing it more, and yet something else always feels more important. The second is that I think we don't yet have a collective understanding of what good documentation really is. It's not just writing things down. Over the last few years, I've spent a fair amount of time researching industry best practices. I mean, especially for technology software organizations like the one that we're in. And I've come to think that good documentation is a little different from what most people in our roles think. And writing documentation that's going to have an impact at somewhere like Mozilla, it's a bit of an art. But let's start with the why. But just before I dive in, I just wanted to make just a couple of quick notes about this presentation. So first off, I'm going to deliberately focus on a specific type of documentation in this talk, which could, I guess, be succinctly described as being documentation that is meant to serve the analysis and understanding of data. There's certainly other types of documentation that are important for us to write and read, like say developer documentation, things like that, but I'm not really going to cover it here because that would just make this talk explode. And I think it's not actually as important as that. Second, maybe this doesn't need to be said, but I'll say it anyway. This presentation is coming from my perspective as an individual contributor working as a data engineer. Not everything that I'm going to say here is going to apply to everyone and every role or every stage of their career here. So I guess while you're listening to this, you can apply this philosophy. If you find something helpful in this talk, then use it. That's great. If something sounds strange or just not applicable to you, then you can feel free to let it go. The main goal with this talk is to be helpful to y'all, not to scold you on what you should or shouldn't be doing. Okay, so let's start with a story. As some of you know, I've been practicing Zen Buddhism for most of my time at Mozilla. I'm not going to talk too much about that here, but there was one parable I came across in my Zen travels that seems appropriate as a sort of lead into this talk. It's a short account of an interaction between the Buddha and his assistant Ananda, and it goes something like this. Once the Buddha was passing through a forest and Ananda was with him. It was time for the leaves to fall. The whole forest was full of leaves, fluttering, dancing in the wind under the sun. The trees were standing naked. Ananda asked Buddha, I had not the time to ask because somebody else was always there, and I did not want to interrupt. At this moment we are alone. I want to ask one thing. Have you said everything to us that you know, or are you keeping some secrets? Buddha bent down, took a few dead leaves in his hand and said to Ananda, what I have said is equivalent to these few leaves, and what I have not said is equivalent to all the dry leaves of this vast forest. But I am not keeping a secret, it cannot be said. Those who will understand what I have said perhaps may find it themselves. They are bound to. I have only shown the way. I have not said a single word about the goal. Okay, so lots to unpack in that story, most of it outside the scope of a talk about data documentation at a mission-driven technology company. But I guess the main thing I want you to take out of that story is that transferring full knowledge of something really vast and complex is both impossible and kind of a silly goal in and of itself. So the point of the Buddha's teaching was to liberate all beings from suffering, not to describe some esoteric like metaphysical system or philosophical game, or whatever Ananda might have been thinking the Buddha was keeping from him. The basics of Buddhist practice are quite simple, at least in the permutations I'm familiar with. And teaching Buddhism is more about reinforcing a few small things that have been proven to be helpful over and over and over and over. Understanding the bigger picture, well, that just sort of comes by itself. So moving back to Mozilla, I believe the same thing is true here. When talking about sharing knowledge, which includes writing documentation, we should just focus on a few true things that will help people with what they're trying to do. And then understanding the forest, that takes care of itself. So let's talk about our forest. Every day working here, I'm just like humbled by how many moving pieces are involved in my work. The centerpiece of that, of course, is Firefox itself, a nearly 30-year-old piece of software of pretty astonishing complexity. But then there's the infrastructure that we've built up around it to analyze its behavior. On the engineering side, there's the ingestion pipeline, schemas, pings, derived data sets, experimentation, Looker, GLAM, STMO, the list goes on. And then there's the question of how to actually perform the analysis that that system makes possible, the practical aspects of how to reason about our data in ways that will bring you to correct conclusions. For example, the number of active Firefox users, how do you measure it? Monthly active users, daily active users, cumulative days of use, right? All those things. And then, so this brings me to, I guess, a hopefully not controversial statement. No one understands all of this end to end. There might be people who understand large parts of it. Okay, so another thing about the big picture, as a representation built by humans, our data is basically riddled with exceptions to the rule. Whenever we talk about the telemetry that Firefox submits, a good data engineer will always be careful to say that the number of submissions that we collect is not the same as the number of clients that we observe. And the number of clients that we observe is not the same as the number of users. For any question involving data, there's a fractal of these little exceptions to the rule that might be involved. We sometimes call these things analysis gotchas, and we have a list of some of the most important ones on docs.telemetry.mozilla.org. And here's a potentially incendiary statement. I don't think they always matter. In many cases, I'd call them well actuallys, right? Which, as many of you know, is a pejorative for pointing out irrelevant details in a conversation. In progressive tech culture, we consider well actuallys harmful to people's learning and development. But if your starting point for documentation is explain everything, how are you going to know which of these to include and which to leave out? So now that I've demolished a few straw men, let's build up a better understanding of what we're really trying to do. Writing a good and useful documentation, I would argue, is a way for us to succeed in an aspects of our organization's mission, which I would paraphrase as help Mozilla make better decisions with data. For really important decisions, we can rally the expertise of data scientists and data engineers working together. And then here, there's relatively little need for documentation. We can rely on the tacit knowledge of experts built up over the period of years. I've been involved in a few of those efforts, and the results are usually pretty impressive. The problem is that that approach doesn't scale. In an organization of Mozilla's complexity and size, there are just too many decisions that need to be made for that approach to be viable in all cases. We can't hire enough data specialists to answer all the questions that might come up. So enter the promise of data democratization, right? Pretty popular buzzword. Which boils down to enabling non-specialists to answer questions with data. And then here I'd like to introduce the concept of data practitioner. Who is a data practitioner? I define them as anyone who wants to answer business or product questions with data. That's sort of everyone here, but I think very especially data scientists, product managers, and non-data engineers. I would say less so data engineers, like people like me, since a large portion of our job is simply maintaining the systems that make data analysis possible. I would say common to all data practitioners at Mozilla is that we all have some technical skills and hopefully at least rudimentary statistical knowledge. Or in the case of a data scientist, lots and lots of statistical knowledge, more than I could personally ever hope to accumulate. But they probably also have some gaps in their understanding and don't necessarily have all day to chase down every detail. So this is the thing. What do data practitioners need? What are the gaps that we need to fill? Every data practitioner needs some knowledge to do their work, but the what depends a lot on who they are. A new product manager is going to need something very different from, like, say, a staff data scientist who's been around for years and years. The product manager might need a video tutorial of how to get some very basic pieces of data out of Looker. On the other hand, the data scientist might need a pointer to the place in the Firefox source code where a particular metric is defined. That came up often for Tim Smith when he was here. Or maybe a detailed explanation of how experiment sizing has been done in the past. Totally different needs. And how are we going to write documentation that serves both of these users, as well as the ones that I didn't mention? Okay, so if you take one thing out of this presentation and nothing else, remember this one word, diataxis. I consider diataxis a super useful framework for understanding how to write useful technical documentation. And it has a website at diataxis.fr. I've heard the same concepts expressed elsewhere, but well, one, it's, as I mentioned, it's a really easy word to remember. And then second, they have a really excellent website that has a very cogent explanation of their philosophy and like why it applies to organizations like ours. The key insight, I think, is that there really isn't one type of documentation that's useful, but four: tutorials, how-to guides, explanations, and reference. So let's go through them one by one. Tutorials are extended explanations on how a relative beginner might accomplish a task from start to finish, and they don't assume much knowledge. This isn't something we've actually done a huge amount of at Mozilla, but one piece of documentation that has some characteristics of this style is the Bain ping histograms tutorial, which I wrote for docs.telemetry.mozilla.org. I guess sometime last year in 2020. That tutorial built up from first principles, a reproduction of what is produced by our main histogram analysis tool, GLAM. That tutorial has been linked to and cited for many places, including the GLAM dashboard as a starting point for further analysis. This type of documentation is a lot of effort to write, so we should be careful about when we do it. You want to make sure that writing this is going to provide a really good return on investment. And I think Mozilla is still a small enough organization that hands-on instruction or workshops, might be a better option than writing a tutorial in a lot of cases. So, give it some thought before you spend like a week writing one of these things. Second, how-to guides. This is kind of my favorite type of documentation. How-to guides are explanations for how someone with some background might accomplish a particular task. They're intended to be very short and to the point. They're not supposed to contain a lot of discursive detail about like why something is the way it is, or stuff like that. This type of documentation is, I think, particularly useful for product managers and non-data engineers who usually care less about the details than how to just get the answers that they need. I guess I'd point out that like how-to guides don't need to be really long to be helpful. Like it's the sort of thing that you could churn out in an hour or something like that, and have something useful to show for it. The cookbook section on docs.telemetry.mozilla.org has a lot of great examples of this type of material if you're looking for some inspiration. It's also worth mentioning that this type of documentation, it doesn't necessarily have to be written, and sometimes you can show it to people. So for example, last week, I recorded a couple of quick YouTube videos demonstrating how to use the Looker Clean Explorers to answer simple product questions. Since most of the interactions involved in that task were via GUI, a written cookbook would have involved tons of screenshots and probably been really tedious to both read and write. Whereas a YouTube video was something, I don't know, it probably took me a couple tries, but like it took me about 15 minutes to record all in all. So like a pretty solid return on investment. Explanation. This is kind of an interesting kind of documentation. and I think they're often what sort of data engineers tend to think of. They're longer, more discursive articles about why things are the way they are. I'm a bit cynical about this sort of thing, but actually I think in some cases this type of documentation can be really useful. Though I think good explanations are actually a lot of effort to write. In our context, these types of articles are probably most useful for like people in the data org, like data scientists and data engineers, who might need to know why we collect or process data in the ways that we do. We don't have too many examples of this, but one example that comes to mind is an article called Guiding Principles for Data Infrastructure that Jeff wrote a couple of years ago. That goes into a fair amount of detail about the architectural choices that went into our data platform and infrastructure. And actually, surprisingly, I think well, maybe not surprisingly, I don't know, but I think it holds up pretty well to this day. Like it's still pretty accurate. And I often recommend it as a starter resource for people, who are newer to data engineering. A lot of the blog posts that data engineers have posted to the data@mozilla.org blog would probably also fall into this category, plus or minus a little bit. Okay, so finally, reference documentation. Reference documentation is like an objective description of how things are. This type of material doesn't really contain information on how to do things. That belongs in a how-to or maybe a tutorial, or why they are the way they are. That belongs in the explanation piece, which I was just talking about. This tends to be the type of documentation that experts will look at over and over as they perform their job function. So the Glean dictionary would be a great example of reference documentation, even though it's kind of an app as well, but really it's documentation when it comes down to it. Okay, so what are you gonna write? It really depends on your audience and what your goals are for them. So personally, I've tended to focus on how-to guides and reference material in my documentation journey at Mozilla. I generally feel these are the types of documentation which provide sort of the largest return on investment, the largest number of people helped per hour of my time. Your case might be different, but I think this framework is super useful regardless. So if you take nothing else out of this talk, just remember that word diataxis. Diataxis, diataxis. Okay, so that ends that part of the presentation. So we now have some principles on why to write documentation and what it should look like. This section is pretty divorced from that. It's kind of just a bit of a knowledge dump on tricks and techniques that I've found helpful when writing documentation at Mozilla. So I hope it'll be helpful. These will be helpful to you too. First off, get the data. So there's a finite amount of time to write this stuff, and we really want to make it count. So just as we want the rest of the data organization to use data to make product decisions, I think when we're talking about spending a significant amount of time on something, you should also be using data to inform what you're going to write. This is the impact of writing data documentation. It's basically on human productivity, and that is notoriously difficult to measure. But even still, I think that's no excuse, and there's still things that you can do. So like to use a concrete example, the main ping histogram tutorial I was talking about earlier, the motivation for writing that came out of browsing 3 months of Slack history of the data help channel, or its precursor. I can't remember what it was called. And then we found that the same questions came up over and over, which was basically like, how do I get this data out of a histogram using BigQuery? And we're a really friendly bunch, so people gave really good answers, but it took time out of people's day, and it just seemed like the sort of thing where we should really just have a definitive answer to this sort of question. So I sat down and wrote it. It probably took, I can't remember. I probably guess it took at least 20 or 30 hours of my time. There was a fair bit of back and forth I did with Frank Birch, who was here at the time, debugging some of the details. I got the GLAM team to like review everything I did. So it was a fair amount of investment, but I think it actually really paid off. Anecdotally, I've heard that some parts of Firefox engineering find it really useful. Also, anecdotally, I can't really prove this, but like, I don't see that many questions on histograms come up on data help anymore. It could be that people have just given up looking at histograms, but I don't know. I'm gonna just hope that that article had something to do with that. Okay, and so of course, you know, looking at Slack channels isn't the only way to get this sort of information, and shouldn't be the only way we look at information, because you're only going to see the questions that come from people who think to post on channels like Data Help, which definitely is not all of Mozilla. So a couple of other interesting avenues to look at would be like GitHub issues. What do people file bugs about or find confusing? And another big one that I'd like to see us do more of would be surveys. Like just asking people, you know, like, what do you want? What do you need from us? What would you find useful? I think can be really helpful. So thanks, Marissa, for spearheading an organization-wide survey on data satisfaction. I think that's going to be really helpful. All that said, I think it's possible to over-rotate on this part. You could spend all day figuring out what to do and what to write. And ultimately, like, the cost of writing many types of documentation is relatively low, right? Like a how-to will take you an hour or two. So, and also usually you develop a little bit of an instinct or an intuition for what types of documentation will have an impact over time, which you can revise based on, you know, what you see the results of your work as being, right? So as the saying goes, if you desire to see, learn how to act, right? Sometimes it's easier to just put something out there and see what the response is. Second lesson, keep truth close to the source. Reference material that's kept separate from the implementation is super hard to keep up to date. Whenever possible, I would keep the documentation of the thing alongside it. So a bit of self-promotion. A good example of this is the Glean dictionary. It's generated from the metric definitions checked into the source trees of our applications. So by definition, it's always completely up to date with the ultimate source of truth, which is what our applications are sending. Of course, you know, like in the course of writing this, Lynn and I found like that there were various gaps, you know, in terms of what was documented and what was instrumented. So slowly we've been adding, you know, various features to the metrics files to like augment them over time. So that's something that you have to do, but it's much less effort than like continuously maintaining this sort of secondary representation of the data. And then, so like as a point of contrast, you could look at the derived dataset documentation on docs.telemetry.mozilla.org under the dataset reference section. Like this is still useful, but essentially it's perpetually out of date as people add new tables or enhance existing ones and then forget to update the documentation. While it's tempting to scold and see that as a result of a collective moral failing, I've come to see such things as more of process failures. If you make it really easy to do something and add it to a checklist, people are just much more likely to do it. So looking forward to 2022, I just wanted to give a shout out to the work that Lynn Nguyen started, and Alexander Nicholson is continuing to automatically document our derived data sets generated with BigQuery ETL, which will hopefully replace that out-of-date documentation that I was talking about. I think that has the potential to be really impactful when it's finished, and I'm looking forward to seeing the end results. So please support anyone working on that, especially Alexander, if you can. Next lesson, simplify instead of explaining. So as I mentioned earlier, I did some videos of some common workflows in Looker a couple of weeks ago. While I was working on a tutorial of how to use the funnel explorer view, which basically shows you what percentage of people who did this action went on to perform this action, you know, in a product. There was a part where I was going to explain how to make the y-axis on the graph like display a proper percentage instead of a weird incomprehensible decimal number. That just involves clicking on the axis editor. You can see that here in the slide, and then tweaking some like obscure values. Explaining that probably would take maybe 30 to 45 seconds, like not a huge amount of time, but it's still like sort of an extra step. Then I realized I could just make that the default for the Explorer, like by default, show a percentage, and then I wouldn't have to explain anything, right? I think this is actually one of the real benefits of doing documentation. It can often give us lessons on where our processes and tools are falling short. So, you'll see those opportunities while you're writing documentation, and where it's feasible, take advantage of them, right? And make things easier for everyone. It's the best explanation is the one that you don't have to make, right? Okay, know your tools. Writing documentation, it shouldn't feel like a big chore. If making a small change is going to take hours, it's not something you're going to want to do very often. So I don't know, this could be a whole lecture in and of itself. People have written a lot of really interesting blog posts this fall about developer productivity, which I'd encourage you to read. Dan Liu, for example, but I'll just mention a few things that that are specific to documentation that I've done, in the last couple of years that have really improved my productivity. First, I switched to Visual Studio Code like a couple of years ago, and from Emacs, and I initially didn't really bother to learn the keyboard shortcuts. So I was just kind of fumbling around with the mouse a fair bit. But I think I don't know, maybe 6 months ago, I kind of made the resolution that I would figure out how to just do everything with keyboard shortcuts as I used to be able to do with Emacs. And it's been super helpful, right? Being able to in just a few keystrokes, search for a string of text in the docs.telemetry.mozilla.org source, and then just being able to edit stuff super quickly. It's it really reduces the friction of sort of making a small incremental change to the documentation. Another piece, kind of silly, but maybe obvious, but install a spell checker in your editor. Especially DTMO complains by default if you check in a document with spelling errors. A decision that I question to this day, but that's the way it is. And if your editor will point it out, your feedback loops will be much shorter. And another piece, maybe obvious, is well, maybe not obvious. I'd really recommend installing the GitHub command line tooling if you're interacting with a Git repository like DTMO. It just really reduces the friction of writing up a pull request. You don't have to futz with the web interface or stuff like that. Really helpful. Yeah, I'm kind of making all these points because I feel like the more you can make writing and editing documentation feel as frictionless as possible, the more it can just be sort of something that you do by default when doing data engineering or data science work, rather than this sort of special effort that you have to go out of your way to do. Okay, right in the open. It's probably not going to come as a surprise to people who know me that I'm bringing this up, but I'm going to do it anyway because it's my last lecture. So I'd like to encourage you all to think about how to make your written work available in places that are open to the public, like docs.telemetry.mozilla.org or the Glean Dictionary or whatever, as often as possible. And there's a couple of reasons for this. First, I guess maybe just appealing to your self-interest, it will be good for your career. So I've been at Mozilla for over 10 years, and I'd encourage you to stay at Mozilla for at least that long. I think there's actually a lot of benefit to staying somewhere for a good period of time. And I think Mozilla is a pretty excellent place to work. But that said, there probably will come a time when you want to leave. And when I was in interview loops this fall, having a public record of my work was a big advantage because I could just show it directly to my potential employers. That wouldn't be the case for private documentation on Mana or Google Docs. And second, I guess appealing less to your self-interest and just more to your sense of virtue, I think it will be good for Mozilla. Open documentation strengthens our reputation as an organization with nothing to hide. that does things differently from our competitors. It also opens the door to collaborating with people who aren't employees of this organization, right? So a good example of this would be the Clean Dictionary, a good chunk of which was built by the community during the outreach contribution period. So yeah, I don't know. I realize there's a lot of nuance here, and yes, not everything can be open. We probably can't write documentation on our partner deals and post it on docs.telemetry.mozilla.org. I get it, but I think actually more can be open than people necessarily think. And it's, I think, something that I hope y'all will just sort of keep in mind as you move forward. Okay, so that's all I got. I hope it was helpful. If you ever want to get in touch with me, well, I'd say probably the best way for Mozilla related things is probably via Matrix, which I plan on hanging out on even after I'm gone, particularly in the Glean channels, or you can just DM me. But I don't know, I'll probably post my email as well if you want to reach me that way. But with that, that's it for my talk, and we can open it up for questions or discussion if people like.
Awesome, thanks, Will. Super interesting. I'm going to request that folks use the raise hand feature if you can. But yeah, now for the awkward pause.
Let's say that these questions will be part of the public talk if the talk is made public.
I have one. And it's maybe mostly an excuse to say diataxis a couple more times. But in the diataxis framework, is there sort of like a recommended balance between those four areas of how much of each content should it be the same, or like does it matter? Is there any guidance along that line?
It didn't really, I don't recall reading anything about that. I mean, one thing maybe that is worth pointing out about diataxis is that they kind of acknowledge that probably you're going to apply this framework to a set of documentation that isn't meeting the guidelines, right? Or like, it's obviously not going to meet those guidelines right away. And that like, it's a gradual process to make your documentation look like what diataxis recommends. It's probably a process that will never, ever be sort of fully complete. And I think they really just sort of emphasize, doing it in a balanced way. Like, you apply the principles while you're updating something, like not, but, like modifying the structure, or like, fiddling with the organization to make it fit diataxis is not like probably the right way to apply the principles. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I have some like a few quibbles with diataxis. Like, I think might be, if you applied it literally, it might be a little rigid, but I think it's just one of those tools where it's like, some of it is really helpful. Some of it is really helpful. Just don't, and if you don't turn it into a religion, I think it can help you get on a better track. And yeah, I found it like a really helpful framework to apply as I've been sort of refactoring docs.tmo over the years.
Yeah, I've been kind of following along with some of that, and it seems valuable just like thinking about what you're doing in one of those modes rather than having a little bit of everything mishmashed together.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I've seen readmes that sort of start out with like, this is why this is the way it is, and if you don't like it, you're a bad person, and like all that stuff. Like, yeah, just think about who your audience is and like what they need at that point, right?
I have another quick question, or maybe not quick, but I have another question, which is, do you have any thoughts on how we could improve our ability to measure the return on the ROI for writing docs? It seems like our visibility and like quantification of these things is not ideal.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, there's lots of things that companies try, right? Like with knowledge bases, they have the thumbs up and the thumbs down thing. That would probably be like the docs are now like docs.tmo, for example, is now deployed with Netlify. So you could probably create a little Netlify function where that would be wired up to some database somewhere where you could send like and dislike counts. Of course, you'd have to verify that those likes and dislikes are coming from Mozilla. So it quickly becomes this fractal of complication. Yeah, I don't know. I wish I had better answers here, honestly. I'm curious about, I mean, this is sort of one reason why I'm kind of interested in working for a different organization, because I'm like curious about how other organizations have solved this problem. Maybe some people who are newer to Mozilla might have ideas about this.
I'm kind of tempted to, I mean, as part of collecting data on the documentation that we're, on the questions being asked and how we can best serve our users, maybe we collect data on the number of questions successfully answered with documentation, where it's like, hey, we're asking for this thing. And it's like, oh yeah, link. And then they say thank you and goodbye, and then you're done, as opposed to spending the next half hour intermittently paying attention to both a meeting and a thread on Slack. Not speaking from experience, of course.
Yeah, I've tried. Docs.telemetry.mozilla.org is one of my Slack search terms, and occasionally I get a big dopamine fix when I see it mentioned in a conversation. Yep, that's pretty viable. I mean, the problem is that won't tell you about all the people that like never even asked the question because your documentation was so easy to find. It's so easy to navigate, right? Like, I think, like, for example, the Glean dictionary analytics, like I think there's like 10, I think there's something like 10 daily users or something like that. Like it's recently gotten a bit skewed because it's now linked to from a privacy policy, but it seems like there's like 10 solid daily users who just come back every day or more or less every day. I think that's like, and the number of times that site is linked to on Slack is much rarer. So I think there's like this kind of like silent majority of people who are just happily using the tool and like not making much noise about it. So you kind of miss that, right? Like if you look at like what's going on in chat tools.
I would reference it more if people would let me migrate Firefox desktop already.
Always be closing. Sean, go ahead.
Show my video for this part. Less of a question, more of like I think it pairs well with I like your keep the source of the documentation close to the source of like what it's documenting. I think another key part in my experience trying to get people, like, there's two parts. There's like writing the docs and like getting people to use the docs or making them easily accessible. So I think sort of a corollary to that on the other end from generating documentation and then having it be used is to try and make it as easy as possible for people to where they need the documentation to get to it. For example, like in Looker dashboards or something like that, the tutorial that anyway, the thing that you said was so helpful that people like pinged you and said, yes, that's great. Linking that as like making it easy to jump from there to, and depending on what the dashboard is about, maybe there's other documentation that would be specifically helpful for explaining that and just making it an easier on-road so that people don't have to ask in Slack, like, what's this about? If people are asking, let's put a link in the place where they're looking at in the first place so they can get to the docs.
Yeah. That's really excellent point. I think like one issue is that Looker isn't like super customizable, but or at least the user interface isn't. But like I think that's definitely something that like our friends in data science can do when they're building dashboards, is that they can link to relevant reference material if they think it's going to be helpful for the people viewing it. Should we, maybe we'll close it off to public comments and we can do, I don't know, just if people want to chat about something that they'd prefer not to, that wasn't recorded, open it up to that now.